So let us give a warm welcome to our very own brother from Detroit, Bishop Tom Gumbleton.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. I have my pen here. I'm still writing my speech. Not really. I just didn't get it back in my pocket yet. But thank you, Neville, very, very much for your introduction and welcome of me here today. And I confess from the very beginning that I am extremely honored to be asked to keynote your conference. And also, I am intimidated to speak before such an extraordinary group of peacemakers as all of you are and have been for many years. I hope I can say something this morning that will continue to inspire you, keep you informed, perhaps, but most of all, motivate you to do the work that we all must be committed to if we are finally going to make the reign of God happen, a reign of God that will bring true justice and peace to all the nations. The theme of the conference is one that is very appropriate, but also very challenging. And I think it's important as we start our discussions and our conversations today that we put all of what we say and what we do into the context of Dr. King's speech, from which you have drawn the title for your conference. That speech, as you know, I'm sure, was given by Dr. King on April 4th, 1967, a year to the day before he was shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. It was an extraordinary speech for many reasons, but most of all probably because it was the first time that Dr. King had moved publicly beyond his struggles for racial justice to a public demand that the United States refrain from its militaristic actions in other parts of the world. It was a movement by Dr. King into the peace movement, beyond the struggle for racial justice. It was a step that Dr. King took with awareness that it could well lead to his death. He had already been attacked so many times as a communist, one who was out to subvert the principles of our nation. And when he turned against the war in Vietnam and against the militarism of the United States, it was a very bold and courageous step, and one that I feel certain did lead to his death a year later. In that speech, which he proclaimed in Riverside Church in New York City, April 4th, 1967, Dr. King spoke about his experiences throughout our nation, where he had been trying to promote a nonviolent resolution to the struggles for racial justice. He had done this most of all throughout the South, and many of you, I'm sure, even participated in some of the actions, the marches of Dr. King. Many of you perhaps heard him speak when he came to Grosse Pointe about 6 weeks before he was shot to death. In that speech on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King was talking about his efforts to move his struggle for racial justice to the north. He was in Chicago not long before he gave the speech on April 4th. And here is what he said in his speech as I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. But then they asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence in the attempt to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. Further on in his speech, Dr. King says, increasingly, this is the role our nation has taken. By refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investment, when machines and computers, profit and prosperity rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Further on in his speech, Dr. King challenged the people of the United States and our government by making a judgment. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is a nation approaching spiritual death. These words of Dr. King, proclaimed on April 4th, 1967, are obviously still very clearly words that speak to our present situation. Our nation continues to be the greatest purveyor of violence on the earth today. That is a judgment that is perhaps harsh. Some people obviously will reject it, but Dr. King said it, and he had great reason for making such a judgment. The war in Vietnam at that point had already taken many thousands of lives of young people from the United States, especially the poor and the oppressed. But even more had brought about extraordinary violence and killing to the people of Vietnam, and it was to continue for 8 more years. But even after that war ended, our nation did not turn to the ways of peace. We continue to be the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And I could go through some of this continuing history of our nation. That long drawn out war in Vietnam, finally ending in 1975. But then the low intensity warfare that we carried out in the countries of Central America. Guatemala, for example, where, because we had engineered an overthrow of the government for 40 years with our support of a repressive government, perhaps 200,000 people, at least 200,000 people, mostly poor indigenous people of Guatemala were murdered. El Salvador, tens of thousands of people. Nicaragua, again, thousands, tens of thousands of people because of our low-intensity warfare in those nations. That went on through the 1980s. 1991, of course, we began another war in Iraq, January 16th, 1991. A war that for us was brief, 6 weeks of aerial bombardment, but for the people of Iraq, that meant 42 days and 42 nights of constant bombing. Then 6 weeks of ground warfare. We left the country devastated, all of its infrastructure destroyed, which resulted in the death, the war, the military action, and then the destruction of the infrastructure led to the death of millions of people in Iraq. 12 and a half years of sanctions, 1.5 million people died, over half of them children. Then a second war in Iraq. The third longest war in the history of our country, bringing about again the death of hundreds of thousands of people. 2.5 million people, internal refugees in that country. Another 2.5 million people having to flee the country. We've left behind a nation shattered and destroyed, and we continue to wage war there. And now we are moving our forces into Afghanistan. It never stops. We are the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. But I want to bring to your attention something that indicates even more clearly that we have no commitment to work for justice and peace other than through violence and war. During the past year, the year 2008, the Pentagon published its newest study about what we must do, how we must prepare to wage war in the coming decades. This study is 2008 Army Modernization Strategy. It is the first explicit and official acknowledgement that the United States military is dangerously overstretched internationally. The study states the Army is engaged in the third longest war in our nation's history, and the global war on terrorism has caused the Army to become out of balance with the demand for forces exceeding the sustainable supply. And so in this 90-page document, our military leaders set out what they see as the future of international conflict for the next 30 to 40 years. As the U.S. military understands it and outlines the manner in which the military will sustain its current operations and prepare and transform itself for future persistent warfare. We are planning to be at war for the next 30 to 40 years. According to the authors of this study, we have entered an era of persistent conflict, a security environment much more ambiguous and unpredictable than that faced during the Cold War. But we also, they point out, face a potential return to traditional security threats posed by the emerging near peers. That means China and Russia, as we compete globally for depleting natural resources and overseas markets. The document lists as a preeminent threat to the security of the United States and its allies, in addition to the struggle against what we call our peers, China and Russia, because of their military capabilities. In addition to that, our security, the preeminent threat to our security is population growth, especially in less developed countries, which will result, the military say, in a youth bulge in the world. And this will present the United States with further, and these are the document's words, resource competition, in that these expanding populations in the development world will obviously consume ever-increasing amounts of food, water, and energy. You can see what they are saying. They are saying that we are engaged now in a struggle, a competition for the resources of the earth. And obviously, it is our intent to let nothing stand in our way to continue to be the richest, the most powerful, and the nation that consumes the most of the world's resources. And so as a consequence, the document describes, because of this 30 to 40-year persistent struggle, the document describes the manner in which we must downsize our military might to ensure the survival of the fittest for the U.S. and its allies in future resource wars for water, food, and energy. The document predicts that the 21st century operations will require soldiers to engage among populations and diverse cultures instead of avoiding them. In other words, they're planning to make sure that we have military personnel in every place in the world where we are seeking to win the competition for resources. And the U.S. tactical doctrine outlined in this document shows how we will combine our air, naval, and field commanders, not just to wage war against traditional strategic targets, such as airports, seaports, and bridgeheads, but will of necessity deploy and fight amongst and against the target population itself to win wars. The document refers to this euphemistically as, quote, commanders employing offensive, defensive, and stability or civil support to operations simultaneously. It describes how we will downsize, actually, our volunteer U.S. military, but maintain an ever-present international offensive posture in many countries across many time zones. And when we do this, as we create new technologies, the future force warrior will be deployed among the target population and will operate simultaneously several remote, unmanned ground and air weapon systems. To this end, the U.S. military pledges itself to expand its inventory of computerized, robotic ground weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles. In other words, we are planning to wage high-tech warfare with as few human soldiers as possible, but we intend to be present, persistently waging war for the next 30 to 40 years in order to maintain our access to the global resources and to win the competition for those resources. One further part of our strategy that is perhaps the most frightening, which we must begin to mount clear opposition to, is the movement toward space warfare. A few years ago, the Pentagon published a document called Space 2020, where we intended to be prepared to wage space warfare by the year 2020. We would have military weapons stationed in space, and we would be prepared to dominate the Earth from outer space. Well, that all is contained once more in this recent document. The U.S. military's planned domination of space by its exoatmospheric zone. The document says, I quote, "Space is a significant area of joint development that supports battle space awareness and is the backbone for the national and military intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance architecture, as well as being the domain of choice for commercial broad area sensing enterprises with military utility. Space-based assets will continuously monitor our globe, and we will be prepared to wage war in space at any moment, and to be sure that the United States space forces are deployed, supporting our efforts to fight and win the global war on terror. Space control operations ensure freedom of action in space for the United States and deny an adversary freedom of such action in space. It states explicitly that the United States is preparing to fight continuous resource warfare for the long haul. And we will do it with every type of weapon that we can devise and develop and deploy. Not a very comfortable picture for us as we reflect on Dr. King's warning that those who continue to spend more and more on military weapons of military warfare than they do on programs of social uplift are approaching spiritual death. But before I reflect on how, in fact, we are, I think, approaching that spiritual death, I think it's important to point out that, in fact, this type of military response in the competition for global resources and in the attempt to try to thwart terrorism in our world simply does not work. Very recently, the Rand Corporation published a study in which they examined how 648 terror groups around the world and conflicts created by those groups were resolved between 1968 and 2006. The study found that only 7% of such terror groups were thwarted through military action. It found that The most important way to end terrorism, and the way that in fact it has ended in various places in the world between 1968 and 2006, has been because the terrorists, as they have been named, have been absorbed into the political process. That is how it has happened most frequently, through diplomacy, through efforts to reach out, to understand, to listen. And the second most common way for these terror groups to be defeated is by police work, not by war. War does not bring about the end of terrorism. But what is happening to our country as we continue to be engaged in the current war in Iraq and are now moving that war to Afghanistan, as we continue to spend more and more on programs of war than we do on programs of social uplift, we are approaching, I think, the spiritual death that Dr. King spoke about. And I think that spiritual death is reflected in the violence that takes place in our own country in an overwhelming way. Just recently, over the past 4 or 5 weeks, the amount of violence in our country would be unbelievable if we were not experiencing how it has been happening. I'll give you just a very brief review of what has happened in our country in the last 4 or 5 weeks. On April 4th, the same day Dr. King was killed in 1968, same day he gave this speech in 1967, 3 police officers were brutally killed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, by a 22-year-old man who was wearing a bulletproof vest, armed with a variety of weapons, including an AK-47 assault weapon. On that same day that the 3 Pittsburgh cops were murdered, a 34-year-old man in Graham, Washington, shot his 5 children to death, and then killed himself. Just a day earlier, a man in Binghamton, New York, invaded a civic association, shot 17 people, 13 of them fatally, then killed himself. On April 7th, 3 days after the shootings in Pittsburgh and Graham, Washington, a man with a handgun in Priceville, Alabama, murdered his wife, their 16-year-old daughter, his sister, and this sister's 11-year-old son before killing himself. 4 police officers in Oakland, California were shot to death last month by a 27-year-old parolee who was then shot to death by the police. This is what is happening constantly in our nation. Since September 11th, 2001, when we were attacked in the World Trade Centers in New York and at the Pentagon in Washington, since that date, our nation has engaged in this war on terrorism, continued our war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But since that date, 120,000 people in the United States have been killed in non-terror homicides, most of them with guns. 120,000 people in our own nation murdered since 2001. As we engage in this effort, as we put it, to try to end terrorism in the world, we are finding that terrorism is erupting within our own nation. To me, it's a very clear evidence that we are approaching a spiritual death that results in a disdain for the value of human life, that brings people to think that they can overcome injustice through violence, that they can end war by war. It simply will not work. Dr. King warned us that we had to take a new course. We could no longer be the greatest purveyor of violence in the world without destroying ourselves from within. And my hope this morning is that we will learn well from Dr. King's words and his warning, and that we will ourselves be committed to a different way, and that we will work to bring our whole nation to a different way of overcoming violence, terrorism, and war. And there was a moment in our nation's history, not very long ago, where we began a genuine movement to work for peace, not through war, but through nonviolence. I call to your attention what I think of as an extraordinary book that I urge you to read if you will take the time. It's called The Unspeakable Truth: Why President Kennedy Was Killed and Why It's Important for Us to Know It. This book outlines the steps that President Kennedy was beginning to take early in his presidency that would have moved us in a totally different way. James Douglas, the author of the book, points out that, and this is the start of President Kennedy's effort. On September 25th, 1961, President Kennedy spoke before the United Nations. The first time as leader of our nation, he spoke to the leaders of all the nations of the world. And he said to them, "Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by choice. The weapons of war," John Kennedy said, "must be abolished before they abolish us. And therefore," he said, "it is our intention to challenge," this is 1961, "the Soviet Union not to an arms race, but to a peace race. To advance together step by step, stage by stage, until general and complete disarmament has been achieved. This is what we must do: engage in a peace race, not an arms race." And President Kennedy wanted to move us on that path, step by step, until the weapons of war would be abolished. And war would be abolished before we are abolished. Now, this was President Kennedy's proposal in 1961. But it was a fulfillment of what he had already been trying to do. early in 1961, shortly after his inauguration in April of 1961, the United States CIA organized and was carrying out an invasion of Cuba to overthrow the government of President Castro. In the plans for that invasion, the Pentagon and the CIA were fully aware that it would not work. Although they told the president that there would be no need for U.S. military involvement. But the records as they were published later indicate that the CIA and the Pentagon knew that the invasion would never succeed. But they counted on the fact that here is a young president, one who would need to prove his strength at the beginning of his term. And so when he authorized the invasion, even though they knew it would not work, they were confident that they would persuade President Kennedy to allow the use of U.S. military support for that invasion. He refused. And of course, the invasion failed, but he took full responsibility for it. And I'm sure it was one of the things that helped to convince him that he had to try even harder to wage peace instead of waging an arms race. And it was not very long after his speech at the United Nations in 1961 that we were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And here too, President Kennedy showed that his was a commitment to wage peace, not to wage war. You may remember, perhaps you've read some of the accounts of the crisis in 1962, October. 13 Days by Robert Kennedy is one that gives a clear account of what happened during those 13 days, a time when Robert McNamara, in the documentary called about himself, about war, said that we came this close during that Cuban Missile Crisis, this close to an all-out nuclear exchange that would have ended the world as we know it. President Kennedy held firm during that crisis. On both sides, there was a persistent attempt by the military to convince the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States to go to war. In the U.S., General Curtis LeMay demanded in the discussions that took place that the United States simply bomb Cuba with a nuclear weapon, destroy it. That would end the crisis. And of course, in the Soviet Union, as we set up the blockade and the Soviet ships were approaching the line we said they could not cross, President Khrushchev was being pressured by his military not to give in. Both sides were being pressured, the President of the United States and the President of the Soviet Union, to use military force to end the crisis. But you may remember something extraordinary happened during that crisis when President Khrushchev sent not only official documents to our nation, to President Kennedy through our embassy at the United Nations, official letters that were hardline, no backing down, and we responded in the same way. But then all of a sudden, President Kennedy received a long handwritten letter from President Khrushchev in which President Khrushchev appealed to President Kennedy. We must think about our children and our grandchildren. We cannot let this happen. There was a lot of discussion among the executive committee that was overseeing the crisis. Which letter is the real Khrushchev? The official letters that are adamant and threatening, or the handwritten letter? Llewellyn Thompson, who had been the ambassador to the Soviet Union and was part of the crisis group, indicated that he knew President Khrushchev from many conversations with him, and he described him as a very real human being who did love his children and his grandchildren. And he said, that's the real Khrushchev. Respond to that letter. And Kennedy did, in a more open way, let down his guard, and even proposed, as they began to carry on some further exchange, President Kennedy proposed a compromise. We will remove our missiles from Turkey. No one knew this at the time. Many people probably did not even know we had missiles on the border of the Soviet Union deployed in Turkey that were even closer to the Soviet Union than their missiles in Cuba were to us. We agreed to withdraw those missiles without any fanfare, and the Soviet Union would back down, remove its missiles from Cuba. In that way, we began to wage peace and not war. We saved the world from total destruction. President Kennedy continued on this path of waging peace. June 10th, 1963, he spoke at American University in Washington, D.C. Many people who have written about President Kennedy and his presidency say this is the greatest speech of his whole time as president. It was a speech in which he made one of the first steps towards waging peace with the Soviet Union, ending the arms race. He declared in that speech, the United States will no longer test weapons in space. We would begin this first step toward reducing our weapons, reducing our threat. Unilaterally, we ended that testing, the testing that had been causing acid rain to come up back upon our planet and threatening our ecology, threatening our environment, threatening the people of the planet. President Kennedy ended that unilaterally. Of course, the Pentagon and many people in the country were appalled that he would, in a sense, show this form of weakness, as they called it, backing down. But he never relented. No one believed that he could get a treaty with the Soviet Union, whereby the Soviet Union would also discontinue any testing in space. But by the end of that summer of 1963, a treaty had been developed, signed by President Kennedy and President Khrushchev. Never again would these nations test weapons in space, nuclear weapons. No one believed that the Senate would ratify such a treaty. President Kennedy began to work with all the energy he could bring to the task. And by the end of October in 1963, that treaty was ratified and has never been violated since. It was a step towards waging peace. Of course, all of these efforts ended November 22nd, 1963, when President Kennedy was shot to death. But this is what we must begin again. We must begin to wage peace, not war. We must begin to do diplomacy, not threaten with our weapons. We must end what the Pentagon is doing in its 2008 strategy, preparing for persistent war for the next 30 to 40 years to win the competition for global resources. We must end all of that and begin to wage peace. I believe that we are at a moment in our history where we have a leader who certainly gives evidence of choosing diplomacy over war, of choosing to treat our so-called enemies as human beings, willing to shake hands with Hugo Chavez from Venezuela and smile, criticized for this by people who say you can't ever act in a human way toward your enemy. President Obama seems to be moving toward waging peace. All of us who believe in these kinds of efforts must do everything we can to support this direction of our country. But it will not be easy. Those who profit from the military-industrial complex. And this was what President Kennedy was threatening, as James Douglas brings out in his book. And this is why he was killed. Those who are profiting by it, and all of us do profit in some way through this system that we have devised, whereby we have had access and control of the largest amount of the global resources in the world. And we want to continue, many of us, to continue to be this richest country in the world, use the resources of the planet for ourselves and not enter into treaties like the Treaty for the Law of the Sea, which would provide a way for sharing of resources. It will not be easy to move in this different direction. And I urge all of us not only to make this commitment as we understand what is happening, a commitment to stop this constant development of preparing for war for 30 to 40 years. In order to maintain such a commitment to wage peace, we must undergo a spiritual renewal. Dr. King pointed out that what we are doing is bringing about our spiritual death. We need to undergo a spiritual renewal, a revival, a coming to life again with the message of Jesus Christ. And this afternoon, as you close your conference, you will be using in your prayer what has been devised by Pax Christi USA as a vow or promise of nonviolence. And I hope that not only today, when you make this vow once more as part of your prayer, but every day, every one of us will use this as our prayer. I share it with you now. Recognizing the violence in my own heart, yet trusting in the goodness and mercy of God, I promise, and every one of us must say this with deep conviction, I promise to practice the nonviolence, the act of love of Jesus, who taught us in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. They shall be called the sons and daughters of God. If you have learned how it was said, you must love your neighbor, hate your enemy. I say to you, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. In this way, you will be sons and daughters of your Creator in heaven. And then the promise goes on as we make each of us this commitment. Before God, the Creator, and the sanctifying Spirit, I promise to carry out in my life the love and example of Jesus by striving for peace within myself, seeking to be a peacemaker in my everyday life, by accepting suffering rather than inflicting suffering, by refusing to retaliate in the face of provocation and violence, by persevering in nonviolence of tongue and heart, by living conscientiously and simply, so that I do not deprive others of the means to life, by actively resisting evil and working nonviolently to abolish war and the causes of war from my own heart and from the face of the earth. God, I trust in your sustaining love and believe that just as you gave me the grace and desire to offer this, so you will also bestow abundant grace to fulfill it. Each of us, I pray, will make that promise this afternoon with deep conviction and determination, and that we will renew it each day so that we do undergo that renewal of mind and heart and spirit that will enable us to be those who lead the way for our nation, to become a nation that is determined to wage peace and not war, a nation that is determined to end war before war ends us, a nation that is determined to share the resources of the planet so every person will have a full human life, a nation committed totally to peace and not to violence and war. Thank you very much. Thank you.